Everyone, Aaron here for Zollotech, and today Apple finally sent out invites to its highly anticipated first event of 2022, and it's called Peak Performance. P-E-E-K, not P-E-A-K. So it's going to be about all sorts of new products, and I wanted to talk about what to expect at that event, along with maybe iOS updates and much more. But as far as where you can watch this, well, it's when we thought it would be on March 8th, 2022 at 10 a.m. Pacific or 1 p.m. Eastern Time. It's going to be a virtual event just like you would expect, and you can see all of the information on apple.com. You'll be able to watch it there, or you can usually watch it on YouTube, so it will be streamed at the same time for all of us, where we can see all of the new products and more. So let's talk about what to expect. Now, as you can see, here's the invite that I posted on Twitter where it says Peak Performance. And just like previous events, if we go to apple.com, tap on the Apple, there's a little augmented reality version of this that takes a moment to load, and then you can see it here. So it's hard to see since it's face down, but if we tap on it, tap on Object, you can see the object here, and then zoom in. So you can see this apple that's sort of concentric rings, and you're looking through a tunnel. So as you can see here, if we zoom in, gives you an idea. You can spin this around and there's nothing there as you spin, and as you bring it back, you'll see the actual apple. This doesn't really give us too many hints as what to expect with it, but being that it's peak performance, we're expecting some different things with the chipset. And of course, if you want to add this to your calendar, you can do that here. Now, the first thing we expect, I've talked about for quite some time, is a new iPhone SE. Now, the new iPhone SE has different names depending on who you ask. Some people say it's going to be called the iPhone SE 3rd generation. Other people say it's going to be iPhone SE plus 5G, but either way, it's expected to have 5G. So we'll have a very similar form factor to what we have with the 2nd generation iPhone SE, but instead it will have internals that have been upgraded and also 5G. However, if they keep the exact same form factor, I would expect it to have at least a somewhat slightly larger battery to handle 5G, since it does seem to use a little bit more power. So we have millimeter wave on the 13 Pro Max. If you're going to add a millimeter wave antenna, of course, you're going to redesign this a little bit to accommodate that. So I'm not sure exactly if we're going to have the same form factor 100% or some modification of this. Either way, though, it's said to have Touch ID like we have now, although maybe they'll relocate it to the side on a button and give us a bit of a surprise. But most people are saying it's going to be exactly the same, just with 5G, and offer a faster chipset inside, maybe with some enhanced cameras and more. As far as the colors of the upcoming iPhone SE 5G or 3rd generation, well, we only had 3 with this generation. We had black, white, and red, or product red that I have here. So maybe we'll have the similar lineup for that, or maybe some other colors as well. The next thing we expect is an update to the iPad Air. So the iPad Air 4th generation redesigned the iPad overall. It gave us squared off edges similar to that of the iPad Pro, and it's said to be very similar with the 5th generation iPad. The 5th generation iPad Air is said to have the same sort of form factor with the availability of 5G built in and upgraded internals as well. So we would have upgraded internals, 5G, an updated camera on the rear, possibly 2 different cameras, as well as on the front, we would have a new camera for the front-facing camera, or the FaceTime camera, that would allow for center stage that sort of tracks you around and keeps you in the frame when you're on a call. That's something that we've had with the iPad Pro for a while, and it's expected here. Now, whether or not we'll see iPad Pro at this event is hard to say. Some people have said that that's going to be later on. It doesn't seem that it needs a real big update at this point, but it is about a year out or so, so it would make sense if we saw a new one, unless they're going to push that a little bit further. The largest updates we expect are to the Mac. Apple has been transitioning away from Intel processors to its own Apple Silicon, and now we're about 18 months into this, where they're said to be refreshing their processors as well. So as they refresh the processors, we're expecting some updates to the Mac also. Now, this is the 13-inch MacBook Pro M1 Mac, and this is an incredible machine. Apple was somehow able to make a processor that's faster than what it replaced, but also uses maybe a quarter of the power. This will easily get you through the day and easily edits even 8K video. And so at this update, we expect a new MacBook Air. So we'll talk about the internals in a moment, but MacBook Air is expected to get the largest change with a full redesign. So we could see a redesign that resembles more closely that of the latest iMac design, where we have different colors and maybe a different chassis overall, where it's more squared off, similar to that of the latest MacBook Pros, and maybe we'll even have a notch on the display. but it looks like we should have something very similar across the lineup to what are in the renders that you see here. So we could see something like that, or maybe they'll just keep the current one and change the internals. We also expect an update to the MacBook Pro, the 13-inch MacBook Pro. Now, this is expected to be basically the same as far as the outside goes. So we'll have a very similar form factor to what I have here, with a headphone jack on one side, Thunderbolt ports on the other side, and there's been no mention of MagSafe, although I would love to see that. Also, internally, there's a bit of a mixed possibility where we could see a touch bar or we may not see a touch bar. It depends who you ask. Some people think it's not going to be on the next Mac since Apple got rid of them on the Pros, but I know some people like the touch bar. I've never been a huge fan, but either way, it looks like it could be here or it may not, but we'll have to wait for the event. Apple's been very good at hiding what they're probably doing this time around. But the overall design and form factor is not expected to change much on the MacBook Pro, being more of a entry-level or smaller MacBook Pro. So we may see a small spec bump internally. Also, one very big question is whether or not the Mac Mini will get a redesign. Some have said that it will get a redesign and maybe even get Pro options for the chipset, or it could just be the same form factor with updated internals. I would love to see a redesign similar to what you're seeing here, and hopefully we get something like that resembles more of a Pro Mac Mini option, or maybe a consumer version with a different form factor overall with some additional ports. Either way, I think it's time for a redesign for that, but maybe Apple has some different plans as well. Now, internally, we're expecting an update to the processor. A few months back, or 18 months or so, we got the M1. Later on, this past year, we got the M1 Pro and M1 Max. Now it's said that we're going to transition to the M2, the next lower-end processor. With the M2, we could get a bump in cores, maybe efficiency, maybe even better battery life. And so here's the current MacBook Pro, where we have the M1 with an 8-core CPU. Some have said that it could come with a 10-core CPU and some internal updates to give it more efficiency, and maybe even the possibility of better video processing with ProRes encoders and more. We don't really know 100% at this point until Apple announces it, but many expect an M2 chipset to replace this. So every 18 months we'll have an M2, and every 18 months maybe we'll see an M2 Pro or an M2 Max, something along those lines. However, they still could change it to something along the lines of M1X or M1Z that they've used in the past with the A processors, but we just don't know at this point until they actually announce it. We do expect some sort of spec bump, as there would be no reason to really show a new version of the MacBook Pro. So it makes a lot of sense that they could do that and maybe even transition the iPad Air to an M1. We don't know, again, until they announce it, but it does look like we're going to get some very bumped up internals in these devices. Aside from Apple releasing iPad, MacBook, and iPhone updates, we also expect an iOS update. Yesterday, Apple released iOS 15.4 Beta 5, and that was a bit of a surprise, as many of us expected a release candidate. Based off build numbers, they sort of hint at what's going to be next, and we thought we'd see a release candidate with a final release on the 8th. However, a couple different scenarios could play out depending on what Apple decides. We could get a release candidate in a couple days before the end of the week, and if we see that, then we'll see a final release around the 8th. However, in the past, we've also seen them release the release candidate after the event because they wanted to show off new features within the OS, maybe Apple Digital ID and more, that with Face ID and unlocking it with the mask and things like that. So maybe we'll see some new features featured there. They'll release the release candidate on the 8th and then push out the public version later that week. The release candidate is basically the final version, as long as they don't find any additional issues, that's just released to developers and beta testers early. So we could definitely see that on the 8th with a final release next week, but either way, expect iOS 15.4 as soon as next week. Now, as far as any additional things, surprises and more, well, of course, we could see an iOS 15.5 this upcoming week as well. After the event, usually when they release the public versions, the next day or two, we'll see a next beta, something along those lines. But we also could see maybe updated AirPods or more, but there hasn't been much news about that. So hopefully we'll get a few different surprises at the event, but again, we'll just have to wait and see. So that's everything to expect at the upcoming Apple event, Peak Performance. Hopefully we'll see some surprises as well, maybe a few things we weren't expecting, but let me know what you're most excited about in the comments below. If you'd like to get your hands on this wallpaper, of course, I'll link it in the description like I normally do. And if you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. And if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. As always, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.